There was a whole lot of tension saying, if you speak now, we will lose what little space we have. Right? So the line used to always be, "Khamoshi mein bhi bahut jagah hoti." And you would hear it. And it was an undeniable, we never resolved it. It was, so part of putting this out there was a conscious knowledge that we were breaking safe spaces. We were breaking, not breaking safe spaces, but we were breaking something. Something had to break. And many people, we discussed, Akshay would say, masti nahi ho payegi. Laundebazi nahi ho payegi. You to masti ko naam de doge. Masti gay ho jayega. This will break. These spaces in silence will break. But the problem is, Khamoshi also had these really harsh limits. Right? Because it was, and the privilege to have silence was also very powerful. Like, you couldn't have Khamoshi if you were a hijra. You couldn't have Khamoshi if there was no space in your house to go to. You couldn't have Khamoshi if you couldn't escape. So it was all these, but this was also like, what was this? Is this silence? It's not silence. Is it speech? I don't know if it's speech, but it was this reminder to us that there isn't this one story about identity coming out, politics, naming. There isn't that's what you do. You grow up, become gay, come out, declare it, and live a certain kind of life. That there were all these other ways. The tolerance looked more complex, and that kind of diversity of voices that I really loved. I think the voices that we lost or that we couldn't get were the voices that were at this point just unable to speak. Voices of there was this, at the same time we were doing these collections of testimonials and documentations of extreme violence. Extreme, horrific violence that found their way as affidavits into the court case, but never found their way into the book. And we couldn't, partly because it was, the book needed to keep that balance between celebration and protest. It needed to give people some ground to stand on. But there were many stories, there were stories that we couldn't ask for. I think that, it's not that we didn't get them, it's we couldn't ask for them. We couldn't, I think we talked about, we couldn't go to people and say, bear this, bear this burden. Bear this burden to tell the story of what happened to you so that it may be documented. We couldn't. Actually, when we went back for the case, there was a different conversation because there was an immediate need to bear that burden. For this, it didn't feel right. So there were many stories we knew that we didn't write. There were 2005 was the time when, was that the lesbian suicide thing was right before then, no? That whole spate. There was a year, I think 2003, in Cal. Deepa's article is about this in that. And there was a spate of 8 suicides in 6 months. 8 women couples who left notes saying, we are being forcibly married and parted, so we are jumping in, and 8 of them, and they just came one after the other, after the other, after the other. And what we have that reflected in the book is through a study of violence on queer women that thankfully at that point had come out of TIS. But you won't find that in the narratives, right? You can't bear that kind of weight. And so I do think that there were many voices that were at this point unable to speak, and there were voices. There was also fear. One of the ones that did get written that we didn't ultimately carry was a piece that talked about harassment at a Delhi college. And we wanted to carry it very badly. But the college was named. It was named, it was just there, and one of the things, so we went back and Arvind said, what will happen is legally this is defamation because it's an accusation of a criminal action against the named college. And Yoda was an initial starting press, the only press willing to publish a book like this. There was nothing, there was no protection, there was 377. And the question was, can you fight? And it was like, nothing will get read in the book except that piece. Nothing will get written about in the media except that piece. So what we went to the author and we went back and said, just don't say the name. Say everything else. And say the red brick college on the corner. Say the college named after the gospel saint. Come on.
The college with no public name on the front.
Exactly, the college with no public name on the front. Say whatever, and
college that dare not speak.
The college that dare not. Actually, that was Arvind. That was your suggestion even then. He said, "Call it the college that dare not speak its name." And I said, everybody will know what you're talking about. But he pulled the piece because he accused us of betraying what had happened to him and the testimony of that violence, which was fair, because. But again, we didn't feel like we could take that risk. We didn't feel like we could take that burden.
To get to the question of voices which are not covered, I think that's a point which I mean, you look at the book itself, the fact that it captures some voices, like even the death and the grieving issue we talked about. Yeah. There's a range of experiences out there which obviously are not all covered within this. So the range of stuff which needs to be covered or should be covered. So I think in some sense, that's a continuing project, something which hopefully people can take up and people should take up and cover different voices which need to be covered. Maybe I just want to highlight one voice which I feel should be covered, which recently we were just doing a little bit of work on, which is getting back to the entire issue of the issue of two women who commit suicide, and that's once again something which I think we've not spent enough time thinking about, we've not spent enough time in some sense remembering or memorializing, and it's a very, very important point. Almost all these cases, and you speak to any of the lesbian activists and LGBT activists in the country, they will tell you that these cases of two women who commit suicide, and when they commit suicide, they invariably leave behind a suicide note, Yeah. And there's one case recently in Calcutta, which was this joint suicide of two women, Swapna and Sujeta, and this group in Calcutta called Sappho for Equality followed that issue up, and I mean once again the potential for the story or the importance of the story to be told is all there, because the image which was captured, with Sappho, which was captured actually by the police photographer, is of these two women lying together with their hands around each other and with the sari connecting each other and looking completely peaceful, And they left behind a suicide note which basically talks about their love for each other and makes the one point. It says that if we are alive, we'd like to go to another country. If we are dead, we'd like to be buried together or burnt together. We'd like to be together. And what was so moving for me, what was so tragic actually, was the fact that neither of the families chose to claim those two bodies. Those two bodies remained unclaimed till the very end. And finally, they were disposed in terms of, I don't know how they were disposed, but normally bodies are not claimed. Then the bodies are used, they're taken for medical, they're used for medical purposes, a range of other things, because they're unclaimed bodies. Nobody wants these bodies. So what does it mean for a family in death to say that we don't want to claim the body of our own daughter? And that's once again, it's a very important, once again, I don't see the stories to be told, but I think memories to be preserved, and things to be remembered. Just as Devdutt remembered the death of that one man in the fleeting encounter, the story of these two women, and not just these two women, the number of women who committed suicide. So how do we continue to remember and write the stories of cases such as this, or issues such as this, or people such as this? So really the point is, I think it's really, if you look at the book, it's really about stories who are in many senses very ordinary people, but they're moved by something extraordinary, which is their love for each other, or which is a passion for each other. Some strange passion which takes them out of the ordinary, makes them extraordinary. And it's that story which I think needs to be told. And this book makes one part of the attempt. I think there are many more such attempts which really can and should be made. So if you ask me what it leaves out, I say a whole world. A whole world which really needs
many worlds, yeah.
So what is it about the written word then, as a form, that makes it fundamentally different from something that's more visual, something that's film, that's any kind of visual art, and the place of that, the written word in movements? Yeah. How much of your book, for instance, drew on the movements before you? How much do you think it helped shape what came after? And what is the place of the written word in itself in larger movements, in larger kinds of organizing?
It's a tough one, eh? It is. Someone once said to me that what the queer movement in India needs is 2 good films. That's it. And he said 2 good films will do much more than 20 good books. And it's hard in India to disagree with that. Huh? The power of cinema and of the visual in India is quite tremendous, But the films we got were Fire and Dostana, and that's so in that sense, you feel a little bit on surer ground in this form. But I think that, I've always been very moved, for example, by the Zuban does this fantastic series called Poster Women, which is a history of 20 years of posters from the women's movement. And what the impact of that is a very different kind of impact. So I think the middle ground for me is, and I think the unexplored space in queer politics is actually queer popular culture. And is queer popular culture that is visual and emblematic and powerful and direct and quick. Because I think that I think books do very different things to movements. I think books have the luxury, the moment to reflect, but also to change what they reflect. They're not just mirrors, right? There are moments where, I mean, in this, we were very clear that we didn't want to document what was happening. We wanted to push and allow something new to emerge. Books allow you space for language. They allow you space for words. Yeah, and it's one of those things where when you see the 377 judgment in the Nas course, in the Nas case, one of the things that I love about that judgment is Arvind's favorite line in it, which is that Nehru said that words are magical things. You know, and Che Guevara said ideas are also weapons. You know, and I think that there was that really wonderful moment in which Che Guevara once wrote a letter to the New York Times from deep inside the jungles in Mexico, right? And they asked, and there was a picture, author bio, standing there, machine gun bullet strapped to his chest, holding a bazooka, and he's written a letter. You know, it's like one of those things when you have a very irate, like Punjabi housewife, which is like, I'm going to write a very strongly worded letter in protest, right? And so he wrote this, and at some point someone later asked him, they said, how do you write a letter sitting, holding semi-atomic guns, doing armed resistance against the state? And he said, ideas are also weapons. And so I think for me, very much the point about what books can do is that books can endure and bear a burden that's beyond documentation and reflection. Books can create. Books can allow you, and they can create in multiple ways. They can allow you something that is not just sensory, but sensory over a period of time, and that allows you to immerse, go back, look again. They can hand you this repository of ideas that you can keep going back to. And I think every time I feel like we wrote or put together a good book is because it's still here. Like 8 years later, this is not current. That it doesn't, you know what I mean? The world in many ways has changed, but there's something about its words that allow it a life. And I think that I think the visual is very powerful in affect. The visual is very powerful but poetry is like that. So it's not just text and visual. Poetry is like that. What poetry does, what music does, what the visual does is, you don't know why, but it changes something inside you. It makes you feel something. This comes in when you have the feeling. This comes in and tells you what to do with the feeling. So I've always thought about it in that way. I don't think you can, I think the visual and the poetic and the affective makes you want to read. And when you read, it tells you what to do, tells you how to think. That's the way I line them up. That may be because I am an academic and I'm a terrible artist. And
so it has been 8 long years, and how would you do this differently if you had to start from scratch today, if there was no Because I Have a Voice before, how would you do this differently? I mean, the world has changed, queer politics has changed, what queer people want has changed. How would you do it differently?
Would you do it at all?
Maybe I wouldn't do it. I'll say that somebody else needs to do it. That would be my response. Because, I mean, the world has changed and it needs to be captured by different people. And I really think there's space and importance for that, you know. And this has been done at some point in time. I think other people will take it forward in different ways. So, confidence which people have, which is quite remarkable. I mean, we were just talking about it in the context of this, I think in Bangalore there was an event organized by this group called Queer Campus. I don't know if any Queer Campus members are here. And they organized it at this place called the Vishranti Nilayam. And they had a range of performances, and they were quite out there, you know, in terms of, I mean, skimpy clothes, performances, the range of stuff and all that, which is all fine. The only problem was that it was all done in a space which belongs to the nuns, you know. And
belongs to the nuns.
Nuns. It is a nun. It's a nun establishment, as it were.
Strong queer history to read. It's a strong nun establishment.
That's a good point. That's a good point, because the nuns were like, you know, they said they're really offended. They said, you know, it's horrible. People have been calling us up from the last couple of days and telling us that we are just like you, and so it's horrible. How can they say these things? And we were thinking about it, that for us it might have occurred that, you know, I mean, nuns, maybe we should take them into consideration, but I mean, there's a certain way, certain sense of,
brazen.
confidence, which I think is quite endearing in its own way. So I think it's quite charming in its own way.
No, I think it's palpable. I think there is a, and it's palpable in many. I don't think it's palpable just for queer people. I think it's palpable all across. I was talking to someone, especially after the recent events post December in Delhi. I was on a bus with a friend, and she's a woman of my generation, let's say, and we were both going, and she looked at this girl, right, on a Delhi bus, standing there, and she was just smiling. So I looked at her and I said, "Why are you smiling?" And she said, "Look at her." So what do you mean? She said, "Just look how she stands." And I looked at her and I was like, and clearly like this moment was happening that was going straight past my head. And I was like, okay, I'm just not seeing it. Like, what is it? And she said, she's just, and then she said, just look for two. And I got what she was saying. This girl will stand in a bus in January, this January, not any January, but this January in Delhi, with an air of just certainty. She said, I can never stand like that. She said, it's not that I'd feel threatened. She said, I don't know. It's not in me to stand like that. I was never, and what is amazing about it is that, and I think that there was this, and she said, that's why I'm smiling. I'm smiling because I look at her and say, good, because I took the same bus to college every day. But it was that, and that's the way I feel about this generation of queer people, is that there is a sense of self, an unquestioned sense of self, that is remarkable to watch. That is just, and it is this way in which it's exactly that moment you wanted, because everything you wanted as a queer person, in some way, was the right to forget.
Right.
Even if you forgot momentarily or for weeks, just to forget your sexual identity, because you didn't have to think about it all the time. Because it's the way power works. And you don't think of your caste if you're Brahmin, but you never forget your caste if you're not. And that you don't think of your gender if you're a man, but you never forget it if you're a woman. And it was that, so forgetting, this generation in moments forgets. And they become whole. I think they become people. They don't become gay people, they just become people. And I think there's a way in which there's a real sense of wonderment about that. The flip side of it, because as you age, you have to be slightly cranky, otherwise it doesn't go well. The flip side of it is that it's a generation that seems to have
no sense
of history. But I hate saying it because it sounds so school mommy. But there is a way that every once in a while that I just find it kind of bizarre, but it's entirely my problem, and I'm well aware of this, right? So it's not a generational thing. But every once in a while I look, and I think what's catching us by surprise is when this book was written, you could largely actually say that most public queer people thought more or less along the same lines about politics, and you just cannot say it now. And what's happened now is, someone asked me what has changed after the Delhi High Court judgment in 2009. What's changed is you can now openly dislike queer people.
Right.
And you no longer have to pretend that there are solidarities that hold you together simply because of your sexual identity.
Yeah.
And that's a wonderful thing. It also means that there are crazy, that's a very loaded adjective, there are opinionated, right-wing leaning Hindutvadi gay men, and you're suddenly like, yeah, you and I do not have a community, let's be very clear. My logical position is that. But so I think that, there's a way in which I think we took the radicalness of queer politics for granted. We took the fact that queer politics would be progressive for granted. We took the fact that we would come from these positions and we would challenge structure and challenge dominance. And you can't take it for granted, because queer politics doesn't have to be egalitarian, and it doesn't have to be inclusive, and it doesn't have to be progressive, and that doesn't make my version of queer politics any more right. I'm just saying that from where I stand, it's a bit of a struggle, because I think that sometimes you see the replications of precisely the kind of casteism and sexism and patriarchy and classism that this intersectional position gave you a chance to fight, right? There was in some senses, being queer was also a privilege, because it allowed you a position where you saw this system and you could fight it. But that came out of partly an experience of being outside. And the truth is, black people are racist, and Muslims are communalist, and Dalit people are casteist, and Hijras are homophobic. And so the easy solidarities don't line up. And so I worry sometimes, in a very grandmotherly way, that the progressive potential of queer politics is this story that we still tell ourselves. I mean, and so sometimes I worry about it. And I think a lot of the new groups that I see are fantastic. And a lot of them that I see, I don't know, they look so different from the groups that I was part of that I don't recognize them. But I don't have to recognize them, which is a good thing. So they will make their own way.